Well, good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Bernie Hogan. I'm an associate professor and the director of graduate studies at the Oxford Internet Institute. And it is just a real treat of mine to be able to introduce this talk here. So to everyone online and to those in the room, so welcome to Enshittification and Extraction. The internet sucks now. We're delighted to have Professor Tim Wu and Cory Doctorow here with us today to discuss the forces that drove the internet into its, as said here, current miserable state. And honestly, I agree with that wholeheartedly. So I'm as keen as you are. They both also have a prescription for taking it back, making it new, a good internet, one that might be fit for purpose. Now, I want to let people know some things about this evening's talk. The first one is that there is a film crew here, but you will not be filmed. The film crew will only be focusing on the front of the stage. It will be posted after the event. And yes, it's not going to be it's not going to be filming any audience members. I won't be giving too much of an introduction because that's part of the point. That's what they're doing here, is to introduce their work and their book. And I hope that it really enchants you and really brings you closer to them, but maybe not right after the talk. Immediately after the event, both Tim and Cory will be moving upstairs for a book signing, and so we'd ask at the end to just give them the space, let them to get up there, and then if you want to go up and say hello afterwards, you're certainly welcome to do that. But thus, I'll be back here in an hour to mind the Zoom questions. But until then, I'm as excited as you are. Please welcome Cory and Tim. Thank you.
So, hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. And thanks to the Oxford Internet Institute for hosting us. Really appreciate that. And thanks to the booksellers for coming out. So Cory and I agreed on a format, which is we're going to sort of introduce our books for, a few minutes each. And then we're going to have, a random Cory-Tim conversation and see how that goes. So that's basically our format. And then we'll have questions. So thank you all for coming. I want to talk a little bit about what led me to this book, and say one other thing I want to mention. This book was dedicated to my daughter, Essie, who's right there in the front row. And so thank you, Essie, for the inspiration. I think I said somewhere that without my daughter's help and inspiration, I probably would have finished the book in half the time. Any case, I wrote this book, and a lot of it is, as the introduction suggested, trying to figure out what happened to this dream, basically, of the 90s internet. What happened to this vision we had that the internet was going to make everybody rich, that it was going to turn every country into a flourishing democracy, that small was going to be the new big, that every person with an ounce of creativity was going to have their own, soapbox or studio or be able to reach the world with their talents. This sort of optimistic vision, which I will admit I was deeply enraptured with, it being kind of a connection to some of the, and I think we'll talk about this later, some of the inspirational utopian ideas I grew up with in the 60s, well, I didn't grow up in the 70s, in the 70s and 80s in Canada, where Cory and I were classmates in elementary school. So, I was deeply into this, and I kind of wrote this book to try to figure out what happened. In some ways, Cory is sort of asking the same question. I think our answers are somewhat similar, but I'll tell you where my path led me. It led me to a particular interest in the platform and the sort of under-analyzed power, and the power we didn't understand that well that resides in platforms. So maybe that will require me to say what a platform is. I'll back that up a little bit. Another way I started writing this book is sometimes when I'm writing a book, I have a sentence that I kind of want to start with. And the sentence I had for this book was, everything has to happen somewhere. That's how I thought I'd start the book. Now it's on page 80 or something. But I was going to start the book that way. And the reason I said that is because it seemed very important to me that every civilization has certain spaces where transactions are consummated, where people buy and sell, where people meet, where it's possible to speak. For much of human history, these were sort of physical spaces. So I'm talking about platforms. These are physical spaces. I was in Rome 2 weeks ago with my family, some of them are here. And, if you go to ancient Rome, there's the Forum, and, it's all happening there. You've got the buying and selling. You have where they gave political speeches. You have the temples. You have the courts. It's all kind of there in this physical space. Ancient Greece was famous for its spaces. And in our times, the most significant spaces, there's still some physical spaces. Here we all are, sort of in one of them. But most of them are online spaces. And most of what I think went wrong is we sort of misunderstood the public nature and the importance of the public nature and the neutrality of these central platforms or central spaces in our society. And I'm, moving back to the early 2000s, I think we sort of took it for granted on the early internet. We thought, well, the web is free and open. We thought we have open source. We thought that somehow the internet, by its very nature, would resist privatization or resist economic power growing. In writing this book, I went back and read a lot of the writings from the 90s and early thousands, and there was this sort of extraordinary optimism, but also this big blind spot to the underlying power of the platforms. So this book chronicles kind of what happened and how the platforms which were born, the tech platforms, which were born in this spirit of hosting others, in the spirit of catalysis, in the spirit of making things happen, being places to speak, gradually, piece by piece, understood how to take more and more power for themselves, how to seize margins, how to seize wealth, and finally have become, in our time, I think, the most sophisticated technologies of extraction that humanity has ever built. Piece by piece by piece. So that, I don't want to go on forever on the introduction. That is basically the main narrative of this book. Some of the stuff that maybe we'll talk about, we'll cover, was the kind of turning points, I think. There's a couple big turning points, I think, in that development, including, maybe I'll just stress one of them at least. One of the things I think was a moment where the internet, as it could have been and as it became, turned, was in the early 2000s, when Google, which was, I think, the most idealistic of the early internet companies, Google, which attracted so many people I knew, I think Cory knew too, to like the company that was do no evil, and their only goal in life was to organize information. And, I think they had this line where we'd want you to come to our platform and then leave, find something else. Well, they had a lot of ideals. I think they were sincere. But possibly this is a Silicon Valley sin, or maybe just humanity. They kind of had to have it all. So not only did they want to do all of the, serve humanity, do all these things, the founders also had to be extraordinarily wealthy. Like that had to happen, I guess. And they, in 2002, when they went public, decided to choose the normal corporate form, Delaware Corporation, for people who track these things, which created a structure whereby they would be constantly exposed to the pressure to make more and more and more and more money, which, leads, and have to add advertising, have to do everything that Cory described so well in Enshittification. They'd have to, basically, they set themselves up for Enshittification. And, I went back to that period, and you guys may remember this, but people may remember this. The effort to resist it was contained in a letter which was called A Letter to Shareholders. And, the founders wrote it, and they said something along the line of, we're not an ordinary company, and we don't want to become one. We're not going to be profit-seeking. We put the good of humanity over our own profit. All this long list of things in their letter. I think if you go back, and I think they have violated every single promise made in that letter, but it's all in there. It gave me one of the conclusions of the book, which is, over time, that structure beats good intentions. You can have whatever kind of vibes you want, but if you face this kind of relentless pressure to make money quarterly, increasing sums of money, that it will drive you in directions you might not have imagined. And I'll end this with the counter story, just to suggest that a different future was possible. So Jimmy Wales and Wikipedia in the early 2000s also had an incredibly popular website. I think one of the top 5 in the world in terms of traffic at that point. And in a certain sense, Jimmy Wales had a button sitting there, not literally, but figuratively, that he could have pushed and would have made him a billionaire. And I wonder if he thought about it, he would have had to roll his own nonprofit, but he had this button. And unlike the Google guys, he didn't push the button. Wikipedia became a nonprofit, and it's not perfect, but no one's accused Wikipedia of throwing any elections or, perpetrating Holocaust. And I mean, there's weird stuff, like they have entries on Marvel characters that are longer than political figures and things like that. But it's a totally different story, and it sort of, to me, suggests a different structural path that could have been, and also suggests some hope for the future, which is to say, I think we can return to that vision where the platform is actually enabler of a lot of people building, creating, and doing stuff, without it all being a giant opportunity for extraction, with it actually being something closer to that public-private mixture, which all great civilizations have, which we have run away from, which we have forgotten, where we have let just a tiny number of companies with a limited number of ideas decide that they are everything. And I'll close on this. In the end of the book, I suggest platforms have a problem. They have a main character syndrome. They think they're it. They think that they have to be let alone so they can deliver the future. And so if anyone interferes with them, as Mark Andreessen says, you're committing a crime if you're interfering with the progress of AI or whatever it is. But that is not how the great periods of building in our world have been. They have been on top of neutral infrastructure. This book is partially about net neutrality. I'll say that for those of you who are interested in my earlier work. The great building periods have been on top of neutral infrastructure, whether it's the electric network, whether it's the trains, once we figure it out. And the truly great civilizations are run by a lot of people with a lot of builders and not just a few. So that's my rant to begin the book, and I'll turn it over to Cory.
Thank you, Tim. A round of applause for Tim, please. Whoa. Localized gravity storm. So Tim and I have known each other since we were 9 years old. Like all the best Americans, we are Canadian. And we have had this extraordinarily parallel life, some of which is, I think, coincidental. We both fell into the orbit of Lawrence Lessig and so on. But some of it has actually been that once we became reacquainted, Tim sent me an email after running into a woman I was dating and figuring out that where I was and what he was doing, saying, I'd like to start by apologizing for shooting your dwarf in the back with my crossbow in 1981. It's been moved on since then, and we've had a very fruitful dialogue, both
That was a D&D reference. Sorry to interrupt you, in case you think I actually shot
a dwarf in the back with the crossbow. Yeah, a little Lionel Shriver cut there. And so Tim and I have known each other all this time, and our lives have paralleled in part because we've been in dialogue with one another. And these books, without being planned, are very much in dialogue with one another. And listening to Tim talk, I went through about 5 different ways of talking about my book in relation to his, and I think I've got it. And I want to say that there's a lot of people who are very angry about how these platforms that we rely on and that are important to us, and then we make our livelihoods and engage civically and politically, and how we find our flats and our jobs and get our degrees and fall in love and stay in touch with the people we left back home when we emigrated and so on, how these platforms have all gone bad. It's quite terrifying to have all of that import vested in these platforms that have gone bad, and there doesn't seem to be any way to replace them. And there's one way of doing it, which is the, oh, well, it's your fault. You're a consumer, and we all know that the only election that matters is the election where you vote with your wallet. You voted bad with your wallet. You decided that you were going to only get free things, and it turns out that if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. I think this is an extremely dumb way of thinking about this problem. It's like saying the reason the wildfires are burning outside your door is you didn't sort your recycling well enough, right? This is not a consumption choice problem. So then there's like if we're going through the galaxy brain meme, right? The second panel here where things are a little more correct is it's like, well, it's these, ketamine-addled Zuckermuskian failures. They're such obviously terrible people, and they're the ones who've done it. And it's true, they have done bad things to us, and there's no question about that. But I think that if you look more carefully at this, what you'll find is that they're filling a Zuckermuskian-shaped hole in the policy environment, and that it's not that they are unique figures in history. It's rather that our policymakers in living memory took a series of policy decisions that they were advised against by experts who warned of the likely outcomes. They did it anyway, and they created what I call the Enshittigenic policy environment, right? A policy environment in which it doesn't matter who's at the top. This is the way that they're going to end up behaving. And if they don't, someone will depose them. You know, if Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk pops his clogs tonight and ketamine overdose, there will be a succession battle overnight of like 10 horrible big balls, and whoever emerges victorious will be indistinguishable from Elon Musk. He is filling the Musk-shaped niche. So one of the things that I'm trying to do, and that Tim has done so well in his own work, is recover some of the forgotten policy history, because there's something extremely distressing and demoralizing to think that the reason things have gotten bad is teleological, right? We are just living through a moment in history where the platforms were doomed to decay, right? It's the iron laws of economics. It's the great forces of history. It's not policy choices taken by named individuals in living memory who were warned about the likely consequences and did it anyway. And if we can recover that, well, on the one hand, we can make sure we don't invite those people out to dinner anymore, and we can leave them at home polishing their fake Nobel Prizes in economics. But we can also make different policy choices. We can reverse the Enshittigenic policy environment. And so, we talk a lot, both of us, about platforms, and many of us are very interested in it. Catherine Judge in the front row here is, an authority on intermediaries. And when the internet started, we were very worried about intermediation. We wanted disintermediation. It was because the intermediaries in our life had stopped being helpers and had become gatekeepers. And there's nothing wrong with an intermediary per se. When Tim and I were growing up in Toronto, I don't know, do you remember Crad Kolodny? Did you ever run into him? Crad Kolodny was this outsider author. And he would write his own books, he would typeset them, he would print them, he would bind them, and then he would sell them on a street corner with a sign hanging around his neck that said, "Very famous Canadian author, buy my books." Or if he was feeling very salty, he would just wear a sign that said, "Margaret Atwood." And Crad, he was a force of nature. He had, this was before two-party consent for recording, so he had a hidden microphone, and he would record the drunks who abused him, and then make best of cassettes, which he would sell as well. He was like the Lakota. He used the whole auctorial experience, right? And you can actually get these on the Internet Archive now. They're called On the Street with Crad Kolodny if you want to hear some vintage 1980s Canadian drunkard abuse. But as wonderful as Crad was, and he was, there are many writers I want to hear from who are not capable of writing, printing, typesetting, copy editing, proofreading, and selling their books with a sign around their neck on the streets of whatever city they live in. And I want to hear from them too. So we need an intermediary, and that goes double for the internet, because very few of us are capable of like gnawing a web server out of a whole log with our own teeth, right? We're going to need someone to provide DNS and fiber and DDoS protection and name service and payment processing, all these other aspects of two people talking to each other. And when we started with the internet, when I started as an internet activist, I've worked for a pressure group called the Electronic Frontier Foundation for 24 years now, EFF.org. And about 20 years ago, I helped found a British analog to it called the Open Rights Group. At the time, I was EFF's European director. And so, when we started with this, those smaller intermediaries, those intermediaries who hadn't yet consolidated, they were replacing these gatekeepers who had started off as helpers, but now had become rent extractors and market structures, deciding what we could see and what it would cost and who would get what share of it. And we took some policy choices that led to vast consolidation among those honest brokers that made them dishonest, right? That made them the kind of people who today we are frustrated and angry with. And, you know, one of those choices, and I think we want to get to the discussion here, but I just want to highlight two of those choices. And the first one was a decision taken 40 years ago among various leaders in a revolution that we sometimes call the neoliberal revolution. Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Brian Mulroney back in Canada, Augusto Pinochet, Helmut Kohl, and so on. And this was a decision to stop enforcing antitrust law. And it was grounded in an economic theory that said that monopolies are good and that monopolies are not evidence of cheating, they are evidence of excellence. That if all of us are buying a product from the same firm, that firm has done something wonderful to entice us into consuming its products, and it would be perverse in the extreme to use public resources to punish firms for pleasing so much of the public. And so we just dismantled, over 40 years, every scrap of enforcement. I do mean every scrap. So, you know, one of the things that the theorists behind this, the Chicago School, the consumer choice, or the consumer welfare advocates, one of the things they said was, okay, maybe some monopolist out there wants to create a monopoly just to accumulate market power. That monopolist alone is the one that we should punish. And so it's a very convenient standard if you don't want to do anything, because it requires that you know why someone created a monopoly, which means you have to peer into their heart, right? And given that's something that no one can do, you can just let people get away with it. But there is a fatal flaw in this, which is that periodically you get a man named Mark Zuckerberg, who has never had a criminal thought that he didn't commit to writing, right? And so when Mark Zuckerberg was buying Instagram and his CFO said, Mark, why are we giving $1 billion to a company with 12 employees? He sent this guy an email in the middle of the night that said, I know you want to know why we're doing this. Well, it's because people leave Facebook for Instagram. They like it better than ours. We can recapture them if we buy this rival, right? We can reduce competition. This is as close as you can get to an email that says, hey, Bob, that guy we were talking about killing, just so you know, it's definitely a murder. And I'm thinking about it, and I'm pretty sure I'm premeditating it right now. But the response of the Obama administration was to wave that merger through, just like the administrations that preceded it and came after it. It's the same thing that the commission did. And this supine posture produced monopolies, and not just in tech, although tech too, the internet's 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4, but in every sector, telecommunications, semiconductors, cheerleading and professional wrestling, equestrian sport, glass bottles, vitamin C, sterile bags filled with saline, right? All 5 or fewer firms. And, you know, one of the points of recovering this history, that the dismantling of antitrust law led to monopolies, is it can make us feel like we're not prisoners of these great forces. And we can remember that we used to not have a rat problem because we were putting down rat poison. And then these guys came along and they said, I'm pretty sure you don't need the rat poison. They took it away. And now rats are eating our faces off. And these guys are sitting there saying like, well, how do you know it's our fault, right? Maybe it was like sunspots that ushered in the time of the rat, making them more fecund than at any time in human history. And yes, obviously the rats did buy the rat poison factories and shut them down. But look, we are not putting down rat poison anymore. This is just economically rational. This is a Pareto optimal outcome. So that's the first policy I want to recover here that led to this. And the second is one called anti-circumvention law. And anti-circumvention law, it's quite a nuanced legal idea, but in its nutshell, it's that if a manufacturer designs a product in such a way as to resist user modification or modification by third parties, it becomes illegal to modify it, right? Even if you're doing so for a lawful purpose. So in other words, if you have a device and the software in it, the programmer's gone in and drawn a kind of dotted chalk line around part of the code and has written next to it, do not look inside this dotted chalk line, nor should you change it, then looking inside or changing it becomes illegal, right? So it's not illegal to put generic ink in your printer. Parliament has never passed a law saying if you buy a printer from HP, HP supplies you with the ink. But HP uses a digital lock that checks to see whether the ink is an OEM cartridge. And it's against the law to modify your printer to disable that. And so it becomes a felony to put your own ink in your printer, right? Under Section 12(1) of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, it's a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine. It's basically felony contempt of business model. And this has a completely predictable outcome, which is that if you you allow a firm to take some pro forma step that then permits it to mobilize the resources of the state to punish new market entry and competitors who do things that make their products better in a way that recovers value that they've harvested for themselves against the interests of their customers or suppliers or workers, that they will do so, right? And so this absolutely foreseeable outcome is that 4 companies cartelized the inkjet printer market. They raised the price of printer ink until it is now the most expensive fluid you can buy as a civilian without getting a permit. It would be cheaper to print your grocery list with the semen of a Kentucky Derby winning stallion than the $10,000 per gallon ink that HP sells you. And no one enters the market and makes the software that disables the inkjet checking in the printer and takes some of that margin. You know, when Jeff Bezos started Amazon, he turned to the publishers and he said, your margin is my opportunity. I mean, he's not wrong. But with these guys, it's always disruption for thee and never for me. When we do it, it's progress. When you do it to us, it's piracy, right? Every pirate wants to be an admiral. And so, you know, the introduction of these policies, it wasn't against a backdrop of ignorance. We knew that this would happen. When this was being contemplated in America by a guy called Bruce Lehman, who's still alive, still a millionaire, still respected as an important IP lawyer, when he conceived of this, you know, Pam Samuelson, a great copyright scholar, whipped a group of scholars to write papers about what would happen. He ignored them. In Canada, they took 3 cuts at passing this law. Each of them was a bigger failure than the last. One of them, it was a minister from a party, the Liberal Party, who, when she tried to get this law over the line, it was so unpopular that not only did she lose her seat, but it flipped to a rival party for 20 years. Canadians didn't want this. And in 2010, we had 2 MPs, ministers for the Stephen Harper Conservative government, who were charged with getting this over the line because the Americans had threatened Canada with tariffs if we didn't enact a law like this. And they conceived of a plan to make this unpopular thing at least palatable. And they said, we'll consult on it, everyone will feel heard, and then we'll whip the caucus and get it over the line. And so they held a consultation. It was a terrible catastrophe for them because 6,132 of us wrote in to say, this is a terrible idea. And only 53 of us wrote in supporting it. So it became very hard to pretend that they were listening to Canada. So instead, they went on the attack. James Moore is one of the 2 ministers. The other one was the now disgraced sex pest, Tony Clement. James Moore went to the International Chamber of Commerce meeting in Toronto to give a keynote speech, and he said everyone who disagreed with my idea in this consultation was a, quote, babyish radical extremist. And then they whipped the caucus and got it over the line. And so here we are, right? We're in this moment where if a device is designed to pick your pocket or steal your data or abuse you in some other way, whether you're a gig worker with an app or someone who's just trying to move through time and space or get a job or be friends with people or stay in touch with people you left behind or vote or be part of civics or get an education or get a job, if the technology does something bad, your only way of resolving that is not by changing your technology, not by you know, indulging in the incredible flexibility of the Turing-complete universal von Neumann machine that can run every program, because that's illegal. You can't change it to run the program. You have to convince a regulator to do it for you, to take up your cause. The problem is that when a sector cartelizes, regulators are neutralized, right? 5 companies are not a rabble, they're a conspiracy, and they take over their regulators. And so good luck with that. I mean, here in the UK, in September, Keir Starmer fired a guy called Marcus Bokerink, who'd been running the Competition and Markets Authority in Canary Wharf, one of the most effective competition regulators in the world, who'd been doing incredible work with an agency that had done more in 5 years than the predecessors had done in 50. And Keir Starmer replaced him with a guy called Doug Gurr, whose last job was running Amazon UK. So he's the guy you've got to ask if you think Amazon's ripping you off, because you can't change the app yourself. He's not going to help you. And one last thing I'll say, because this was pointed out to me yesterday. Ireland just fired their data commissioner and replaced him with a guy from Meta. Okay, now that's terrible, right? But many of you may have heard of a woman called Sarah Wynne Williams, who used to be a Meta executive, who wrote a book about her experience describing the way all the bad things that Meta was doing knowingly, facilitating a genocide. Also, Mark Zuckerberg cheats at Settlers of Catan. Under her standard employment agreement that every Meta employee signs, she has signed a non-disparagement clause that is so toothsome that every time she says something mean about Meta in public or in private, she owes them $50,000. The new head of the Irish Data Authority has signed that contract. he is Meta's regulator. He is contractually prohibited from saying mean things about Meta. So that's how we got here. It wasn't an accident. It was on purpose.
Thank you. Cory, before asking a question, I want to put a little flesh or add a little to the story about some of the acquisitions that you mentioned. That you mentioned Instagram, because I was in the U.S. federal government at the time, and there was this period. So one of the ways the main tech platforms consolidated their power was by buying their competitors, and somehow I was in the Obama administration then. Somehow we found a way not to do anything. And sometimes it took some amazing brain work not to do things. You know what I mean? Like it took, here's an example. Google bought Waze in does everyone know Waze and Google? Google bought Waze in 2013. So Google and Waze were the, two sort of emerging map programs telling you, how to get places, both interesting technologies. They relied on different approaches. Google's was a little more central. Waze relied on all these user contributions. It had kind of this, what's this going to be like? Which system's going to win? And then one day Google just sort of bought Waze. And if there's one thing that the US antitrust laws are supposed to prohibit, it is a merger to monopoly. And it's hard to see, given that they were only two companies, how that was not a merger to monopoly. And I couldn't get, when I was in there, I could not get the answer to that question. So years later, I was at some antitrust party. There are such things in DC. And I noticed there was a staff attorney who'd worked on this thing and had a few drinks. And so I was like, how did you do it? She said, oh, yeah, the boss, he really wanted to clear the merger. So we had to come up with a theory. And he said, so the theory we had, he said, is Waze tells you how to go places, and Google Maps tells you kind of where you are. So you use Waze when you want to figure out how to go somewhere, and you use Google Maps when you figure out where you are. So they're not actually competitors. So they cleared the merger on that theory. Instagram, when Facebook bought Instagram, also there had to be this complex years of education. It takes years of education sometimes to be able to come up with theories that no normal person would be able to say without laughing. So not to disparage academia, but this was, maybe I'm disparaging economists. So in the case of Facebook and Instagram, their theory was, well, Facebook is more about friends and is on computers, while Instagram is really more about photos. So they're not competitors either.
Facebook starts with an F, and Instagram starts with an I. So they're in different markets.
But they were actually fully wrote memos to defending these theories. So that's a little bit of the color on those particular things. And it was I think it was shaped that period when the tech platforms gained dominance over the 2010s. I think it was still shaped, and I think it's still shaped to this day, by this idea there's something special about these companies. I think that sometimes in the federal, when I worked in the government, it was like they were charities. Why would you break up the Red Cross was kind of the feeling. These are really nice guys, really great guys, they're doing good things. And honestly, I still feel like that vibe is out there, a kind of you can't mess with these companies. They're kind of, they're the ones bringing the future. I mentioned Mark Andreessen before. I don't know if people in this room have read the Tech Optimistic Manifesto. I guess I'll bring it back again because it is such a striking, a historian friend of mine said that is a primary document. Because it is such a striking statement of this idea that the tech firms, I guess, deserve their own sovereignty. They deserve to be, because they're going to deliver the future. And he honestly says in that document that anyone who interferes by regulation or other means with the advancement of AI could be considered a criminal because they're interfering with something that could save lives and therefore could be committing murder. he says that in this document. So if you ever think about, he didn't, Peter Thiel, a similar vein, labeled a variety of similar people the Antichrist. So it's kind of a similar idea, but there's that idea of sort of, I think that drove this very successfully a lot, this idea it's totally beyond anyone's control. I don't know if you're going to say about that. I have a question for you about discipline, if you
Yeah, I was just going to say
riff
this
off
is a
that.
great entry into discipline, because I think that, so one of the things that really influenced me early on, I read a paper that Tim wrote talking about the telecom sector and connecting it to the entertainment companies. And he talked about how telecoms, being a very mature sector, was a sector in which everyone was personally acquainted and had probably been colleagues, right? Especially when you have a mature sector of just a few very large firms. Oftentimes you've gotten to the point where you just can't get promoted anymore in the firm you're in. You laterally move to another firm, get promoted there. And so you just end up with these kind of personal relations, and that this facilitates regulatory capture. They just all know each other, right? They're all like pals, and they're not really directly competing. And one of the things about tech that was really interesting early on is that a lot of the people involved didn't like each other. They found it really hard to agree about stuff. I mean, my entry into tech policy was during the Napster wars, where you had, 200 tech companies that were in aggregate 2 orders of magnitude larger than the media companies, which were 7 companies. But the 7 companies just ran circles around them because they had message discipline. And of course, now there's like 5 media companies and there's 5 tech companies, and they've merged. So you look from the pigs to the men and the men to the pigs, and you can't tell the difference. And the fact that they couldn't agree with each other meant that if one of them decided to screw you, someone else would very happily step in and make things nice for you. And if they decided to screw their workers, someone else would step in and hire their disgruntled workers. So there were these sources of discipline that weren't necessarily about regulation, even if regulators were supine. And maybe this is why regulators were supine, right? Because this sector was to a certain extent self-regulating, in as much as if it did things that significant stakeholders thought were detrimental, that they would lose suppliers, they'd lose workers, they'd lose customers and users. And partly that's down to this incredible flexibility of digital technology, where market entry could just always fix the thing you'd broken. Put too many ads on your website, someone enters the market with an ad blocker. And then it's not that your users see only a few of your ads, they just never see an ad of yours again because no one ever uninstalled an ad blocker. And so there were these stopcocks, right? These internal sources of discipline. And these people, some of them people running the companies today, they're new people. They're kind of bloodless ex-McKinseyites who've taken over from these, self-styled heroic founders. But a lot of them are still the same people. Right? Mark Zuckerberg's been running Facebook since he invented it to non-consensually rate the fuckability of Harvard undergraduates. He obviously wasn't a good person then, but he treated us better. Sorry. But he treated us better in those days. I mean, I did write a book called Enshittification.
Yeah, that's true.
And he treated us better in those days.
Yeah. I warned my mother, who's here, that we would probably be a lot of bad language. My mother here is in the front row. My wife's here as well. Thanks for the support. She was a name. But yeah, no, one of the things that struck me, and I'll summarize, one of the early things you say in your book, and tell me if I'm wrong about it, is that discipline of many forms is important to the desired performance of any firm, and maybe any institution or entity. I think that
individual. I mean,
or individual too. Yeah.
Unmarried men don't live as long because there's no one around to say, "You idiot, go have that lump looked at."
Yeah. So there's this. It's funny because we both went to a school where there was no discipline, but we'll leave that aside for later. But I wonder if, and one of the things you say, and I think that's right, you describe kind of more fulsomely than the economics profession does. Economists think of market discipline primarily, from competitors, and that's, I think, an important point. And they sometimes think about vertical discipline from suppliers or labor unions and so forth. Like another Canadian, John Kenneth Galbraith. This is becoming a Canada Fest.
We're an adorable people.
But the question but then you talk about other forms of discipline, which I think are important, such as the employees themselves and their own ethos.
Yeah.
I think is very important, self-help. So you talk about forms of discipline that could give us the sort of results we want. I think that's a really important contribution from this book. But one thing I was wondering, in light of what I was saying about the decision of everyone to IPO, go and then come under this pressure. Mm-hmm. Is it more that these firms lack discipline, or that it was the wrong kind of discipline? The discipline being basically the stock price.
Yeah, so this is an area where I think you and I may have a mild disagreement, because I don't think that it's just the venture capital model. Mm-hmm. There's a great Terry Pratchett line. She says she wants best brandy, but she'll settle for small beer. So obviously, like, firms would like to charge infinity and deliver nothing. Yeah. But that's not a thing you can do. And even the most aggressive venture capitalists won't demand that of you. I mean, it is a thing you can do if you're an academic publisher. But it's not a thing you can do otherwise. And, the parameters of what a VC could demand of a firm were set by policy, right? If you are running a company and your VC says, all right, you've got to start locking the ink and charge $10,000 a gallon. And you can say to them, but tomorrow there will be capital formation and new market entry for firms that just sell things that alienate the affections of our customers. And then we will lose the business to them, because once you're buying your ink from someone, you might as well buy your printer. Not a hypothetical. There was a company called Static Control. Static Control refilled Lexmark toner cartridges. Lexmark was IBM's printer division. IBM was at the time, I think, the largest tech company. There was second largest tech company in the world. And carbon is obviously the most abundant element. So it's not hard to get more carbon for your laser toner cartridge. But they had a little chip with 60 bits of main memory, maybe it was bytes of main memory, that ran two programs. One said I am empty and the other said I am full. And when you were out of toner cartridge, it said I am empty, and it didn't matter if you put more toner in the cartridge, it wouldn't work. So they sued under anti-circumvention law. They said it's against the law to remanufacture these cartridges and make a new chip that says I am full, because you're circumventing. But the thing is that circumvention requires that there be a copyrighted work that's being accessed. And the judge said, what is the copyrighted work? And they said, oh, it's the 40-byte program. And the judge was like, well, that's not even a haiku. It doesn't rise to copyrightability. And so Lexmark was able to remanufacture, or Static was able to remanufacture Lexmark's cartridges. Static eventually bought Lexmark, right? So, like, it doesn't take too many of those for VCs to say, no, don't burn the house down. Like, yes, I understand that, you want to start a big fire and get things warm in here, but we don't benefit when you burn the house down. We created the parameters for plunder, right? We legalized plunder, and then they took it, right? They rip us off for the same reason your dog licks its balls, because they can, and we can stop them.
But I guess I'm not talking about VC discipline. I think I'm talking about public markets or public market incentives. No, I'm not sure. Well, maybe we'd have some disagreement here. So what do you think? Okay, let me tell a story and then we'll diagnose it. Let's talk about Amazon for a minute, and we'll diagnose it a little bit differently. So in some ways, I'm particularly interested in the story of Amazon because I'm interested in platforms, platform powers, and because at some level, Amazon and Amazon's marketplace, which is the largest, I think, marketplace in human history at this point, of buying and selling, in some ways encapsulates some of this dream of the 90s, early thousands that everyone wrote about, that everyone who had some kind of idea would be able to sell a different kind of product on there. In the book, I write about these Canadian guys, notice the theme, who come up with they sell a banana phone based on like Raffi, which anyway, I don't see. There you go. A few people understand what I'm talking about. Everyone else is like
beloved folk singer.
Yeah,
and brother to the most important privacy commissioner in Canadian history.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah,
anyway, so the point is, anyone can do anything. And there was a point. You guys remember? Remember Amazon used to be a bookstore. Anyway, they changed, and there was a point, I'd say around 2010, where the Amazon marketplace was kind of, admirable. It was very good at order fulfillment. It was better than eBay. And I think the most key factor is that the margins that we're charging were less than 20%, between 15 and 20%, which is a very good margin for selling, much less than brick and mortar. And so that's how things were. And then, Amazon attracted most of the sellers, most of the buyers kind of established itself into a monopoly, a double-sided platform monopoly. And then they started turning the screws. I think that's the phrase usually, but then they started turning the screws. And, there's a variety of ways, started raising the fees on everybody and so on and so forth. Had rules that people couldn't charge less somewhere else. And then I think the most ingenious one, which we both are fascinated by, is, have you ever done a search on Amazon and you get all these like sponsored links, and maybe people here don't use Amazon, I don't know, but you get these sponsored links, you don't really know what you're looking for, it's kind of confusing. So that little weird trick of having these sponsored links, the sellers are bidding for those spots, which might seem like a small thing, but it turned into an incredible cash cow. 10 billion, 20 billion. For 2024, the amount of money that little thing earned was $56 billion. I think even a little more than that, which is double the revenue of every single newspaper in the world combined. So you could either have triple the number of newspapers in the world and reporting, or you could have that weird little sponsored result thing. And it makes search worse. So it's a pure example of valueless extraction. It's just because you can. And the question is, I guess, Cory, that I'm asking you about. Oh, I'll say one last thing about that. I mean, the early Amazon, to me, had the promise of kind of making a difference in class division, because if anyone could start their own business, I'm very interested in the history of class wealth in the middle class. If anyone could sort of start a business, that had a possibility of really creating some wealth outside of a few sellers. But now these people are bidding on these things. They've really bid their margins. The margins on Amazon, I think, are in some cases worse than brick and mortar now. It has become, in its own way, a trap. And I guess the question, and you have a similar story in your book, is why do you think they did that? If not the incentives of the public market.
So here's the thing. I don't have to tell you that Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act has a blanket prohibition on unfair and deceptive trade practices, right? And that top row of an Amazon search results page is 25% more expensive than the best match for your query. And the top slot, the top left, is 29% more expensive. And so if you walked into B&Q and you said, I'll have 10 Duracell batteries, and they sold you 6 house brand batteries that cost a third more than 10 Duracell batteries, and somehow did this without you noticing, that would be an unfair and deceptive trade practice. And the fines associated with it, the penalties associated with it, would exceed any additional profit they would get from this grubby little scam. And so there are lots of ways you can steal from customers, right? You don't have to defraud them with this Rube Goldberg machine of playing games with the search results, right? You could process payments from customers and then just not give them anything, right? That's a much more direct way of doing it. Venture capitalists or the public markets, they could say, well, we prefer firms that increase their margins by just charging your credit card but not giving you anything. And maybe they keep the card on file and they charge it once a month. I mean, there are those businesses, right? There are these subscription businesses that do this, right? And the capital markets like them. But it hasn't caught on, and hasn't caught on because we do have a more vigorous enforcement environment, right? So it's not like, it doesn't exist like no one came down off a mountain with 2 stone tablets and said like governments and consumers and other entities capable of exerting discipline on firms should simply accept whatever the firm gives them. We are equipped with remedies, sometimes in law and sometimes latent, that could be expressed in law. And some of those are strikes by workers who don't want to do stuff. And one of the things I was thinking about as I was getting ready for tonight, and especially when you're talking about the optimism of technology, is like we grew up bringing our Apple II Pluses over to each other's houses with modems and getting online and dialing BBSs. We were really excited about computers, and computers were opening our horizons, right? I had, a computer in my bedroom with a modem, and I would dial up bulletin board systems. I remember one day my bulletin board system added FidoNet, which was a system for connecting to people all around the world. And suddenly there were dozens of groups of people all around the world I could talk to. And then about a year later, they connected FidoNet to Usenet, which was 2 orders of magnitude larger than FidoNet. And it was like being in the Eames Power of 10 movie, where we just kept zooming out, the world just kept getting bigger and bigger. There's so many tech people who entered the field because their story was like this. The world just got bigger for them. They discovered the words to describe who they really were. They discovered the communities that they were meant to be a part of. They escaped their destiny. They escaped the town or the milieu or the faith group or the values they were brought into and found a more authentic expression. They found love. They found all the things that matter to them. And a lot of those people became tech workers, right? And a lot of those people, I call them Tron-pilled. They want to fight for the user. And so, you know, when tech workers were, as the National Bureau of Economic Research said, making $1 million each for their bosses, and when there weren't nearly enough of them to go around, if your boss ordered you to wreck something, you could tell your boss to go to hell because there was someone who'd give you a job across the street the next day. And so if there are these forces of external discipline, tech workers, rival firms, regulators, new market entry with cool new technology that unrigs the ad, you know, it wouldn't be hard to change the Amazon app to throw away all the suggestions, right? If you could modify the app and even do 3 comparison shops against everything else. One of the biggest problems with Amazon is something like 90% of affluent households in the US have Prime, so they prepaid for a year's shipping. They start all their searches on Prime, and if they find what they're looking for, they don't comparison shop. And it's not because people are lazy, it's because they're busy. And so you give them automatic comparison shopping, which is a thing you can do if you can just autopilot apps and jailbreak them and do things with them. And you could make a lot of money selling that app to people because you'd be saving them money. So, you know, if we had these external sources of discipline, Amazon wouldn't steal a 29% margin on the first search results, and firms would be better off.
You know, I did an event with Lena Khan, who some of you know is the former FTC chair. Anyway, it was the antitrust, and she did an investigation of Amazon, since we're talking about them. And she said on the sponsored result, they don't always give them what they say they're going to give them. There is a little bit of, like, they found they sometimes didn't even give it to them, so they're spending all this money to get the margin. It's not exactly what you're saying, where they just steal from the credit card, but there is a little bit.
Yeah.
And a little bit like that can be a couple, like, you know, $10 billion or someone's life dream. So there's something to be said about that. Maybe we should talk. You know, I realize we only have 6 minutes before questions, and look, my daughter's still awake.
Well, let me talk about what to do next.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah.
What do you want to do?
Well, you know, this book, writing this book and being on and talking to a lot of people. By the way, one of the places my book, and I don't know if you've been to San Francisco. I was in San Francisco, I guess, 2 days ago, and it was a room full of, I think, like former Googlers, basically, as far as I could tell. And I was a little worried I was going to get like kind of a salty, frosty reception. No, they were like, you know, we put our lives on the line for this stuff, and you know, there's people still there. One of my friends said, I won't say his name, he said, I quit Google when I would propose some kind of, you know, project. And they used to be all about idealistic projects. And he said, I quit when they said, well, why don't we just say we're doing that? You know, why don't we just like, can we just say we're doing that and not like, and well, they didn't say not actually do it. So then he's like, I gotta leave this place. But what would I do? I think my conversations have moved me further to the sense that we need to identify the essential platforms in our lives, and as you say, discipline them. And what I'm going to talk about is I return to something that frankly is a British invention, which is the public callings or common carriage doctrine, which is the idea, and you know, the common law was very good about this, sitting lawyers in our audience, as recognizing certain businesses are inherently imbued with public characteristics. The leading case from the 16th century concerns a pub, or an inn, I guess. And it's one where like they threw someone out in the middle of the night, and they're like, you can't do stuff like that. They'll get, you know, ambushed by, you can't refuse service, brigands or whatever. And so there was this very, I think, wise instinct in the English common law that understood that certain, as I said, certain businesses are imbued with a public interest, and then they have certain duties. And, you know, they have to charge everyone the same price. They can't discriminate between customers. They sometimes were subject to price regulation. I think that is what we need for the major platforms at our time, to give them more public-facing nature. Now, unfortunately, you have to pass legislation now, unlike the 16th century. But if I were going to do one thing, it would be to give the major platforms the duties of a common carrier or a public calling, such they can't, and also just eliminate the most predatory parts of the business model, like the sponsored links. Now, that depends on the platform what that means, but that's one thing I would do for sure.
It's fascinating. So during the period of 2019 till about last year, I really felt like maybe we could regulate these platforms. You had the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act.
Yeah.
You had a complete reversal of the direction of Canadian anti-monopoly law. So Canada's Competition Bureau, in its whole history, had challenged only 3 mergers and had never successfully challenged a merger. And yet our Parliament, was whipped by Justin Trudeau, hardly a person with a reputation for fighting large corporations, and they gave them some of the most far-ranging powers that we've ever seen in competition law. So it seemed like there was a revolution underway. You had the Chinese cyberspace law that banned Chinese dominant firms from interfering with new market entrants. It seemed like maybe the regulators were getting the bit between their teeth, but the empire struck back, right? We have Marcus Booker Inc. fired and Doug Gurr, the former head of Amazon UK, running the Competition Markets Authority. Donald Trump's FTC is just a mafia shakedown operation. It's just another thing he can threaten you with, antitrust violations if you don't toe the line for him. Because of course all the firms are guilty, right? So you just pick a company and you charge them with the thing they actually did, but you let all the other ones off, right? And so I've become less not optimistic, but I just feel like we need to make those firms less powerful before we'll be able to bring them under regulatory remit. I often tell my libertarian friends that, even if you think the only thing the government should do is enforce contracts, they have to be more powerful than the entities whose contracts they're enforcing. Otherwise, how can they make their decisions stick? The smallest government you get is determined by the largest corporation you're willing to tolerate. And so we are now really not in a place where this is possible. I was telling Bernie earlier, my favorite joke from Newfoundland, where he's from, that the punchline is, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. And here we are, right? So I have found, I think, a path that takes us further up the gradient towards a better world than I thought was possible. And it's because of Donald Trump and his incontinence, his political incontinence, his belligerent incontinence, his aggressive incontinence. So remember I said Canada adopted its anti-circumvention law because America threatened us with tariffs. That's why everyone in the world has an anti-circumvention law. Article 6 of the Copyright Directive, the Canada-US or the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement, the New Zealand-US Free Trade Agreement, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, the Andean Nations Free Trade Agreements. These are all passed under threat of tariffs from America. And the only reason that other countries are prohibiting their technologists and their investors from defending their people by adding complementary technologies to American exports that halt the extraction of their money and data is because they didn't want to get hit with tariffs, right? Well, if someone threatens to burn your house down, unless you do as they say, and then they burn your house down, you don't have to do what they say anymore. You're kind of a mug if you do, right? And so this feels like a big opportunity, and for a while I was quite excited about it. I wasn't sure it would work because, there's a lot of status quo bias, things get inertia and so on. But then something else happened, which is that Donald Trump, having made it clear that America no longer had allies or trading partners, only adversaries and rivals, was that he would pursue this rivalry through tech companies. Right? He would get Microsoft to shut off the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court's Outlook account as retaliation for swearing out a criminal complaint against Benjamin Netanyahu for complicity in genocide. And there are a lot of lawmakers, including lawmakers who are not sympathetic to the International Criminal Court's case, who are nevertheless suddenly very alive to the fact that this thing that they had been treating as neutral infrastructure, that they could entrust with all of their data and all of their administrative essentials, that this is in fact not a neutral piece of infrastructure. It's not even a firm. It's an arm of policy of a mad dictator. And, we had another situation like this not long ago.
But Cory, I'm still trying, what's the mechanism?
So the mechanism is repealing anti-circumvention law.
I see.
Right? And so the coalition for that, I think, used to be weaker because it was entrepreneurs and technologists, maybe consumer advocates, but now it's national policy hawks.
And you're confident that would diminish the power of the platforms? That's where I
think that it would start a virtuous cycle, right? Where we could make them weaker. We could build domestic constituencies against their extraction, right? So, one of the reasons right now that there aren't people out there briefing for printer ink is no one's in business making printer ink.
Right.
If there was a giant domestic firm that was exporting the software that every guy with a folding table at the back of a newsagent or a dry cleaner spent 25 bucks a month on, then made sure that when they refilled a printer cartridge, it worked. And that firm was making billions in export capital, raiding the margins of these American dominant firms. That firm would lobby like hell in Parliament to maintain an aggressive agenda against these firms. I mean, we see it, you know, part of the European resurgence in antitrust was billionaire on trillionaire violence, right? It was Daniel Ek from Spotify getting angry at Apple taking 30 cents out of every euro he made, right? So you could create a coalition that's much stronger than the one we have now.
Well, I guess if I put my full program out here, and I know we want to go to questions at some point, it really has three components, just to spell it all out there. The one is a very vigorous anti-monopoly campaign, including actually banning mergers that are competitors and, like, you know, not being absurd. And that's something I worked in the Biden White House, and we tried to launch that. I agree the Trump administration has taken things in directions I'm not too happy about, but I do think policy has a longer wave function than politics.
Yeah.
And so and there are, as it stands, still major cases against most of the tech firms, whether they, you know, fall apart, I haven't seen. So I believe in a very strong anti-monopoly campaign. The second thing, as I said before, is essentially deciding what parts of the platforms should be the utilities of our time and treated like utilities. I mean, in some ways, one of the triumphs of the 20th century is the electric network and its role in the economy and our lives. You don't think about it that often, but a lot of stuff was invented or built on the electric network without having to think, oh, you know, before I make this thing, do I have to, like, talk to the owner of, you know, the local guy and see if they like it? Is this, like, toaster going to work better than that toaster because, you know, I paid them off at some level? No, it just worked. It was neutral. They capped the amount they can take. Or was it like, oh, you know, the electric network has strong feelings about, they hate people in this town, so they have, like, you know, they take all their money, or just take everybody's money, because why would you not? I mean, what would you charge? If you were a total profit-seeking owner and you own the electric company, how much would you charge people? I mean, whatever they got, almost. I mean, you've got them. It's almost like the pharmaceutical industry in the United States, is that you kind of have this extraction leverage. So I think you have to figure out what parts are really the utility and then make that into a utility that other people can build on. And the third thing I develop in the book, and I think you allude to it with the discipline from tech, is something called countervailing power. That is, the people who deal with the platforms, giving them room to essentially organize or bargain collectively. You know, good example is news organizations, which have obviously been fleeced by the tech platforms the last 15 or 20 years. I mean, I don't know why. I think they should be allowed to bargain collectively and be like, you want news, you know, pay our price, the same way authors do. Whether you agree with that or not, we can talk about that, Cory.
About this at a different time. I have a whole different view on this.
And labor is another, you know, labor is a classic discipline. I'll go back to the 50s. Galbraith said, John Kenneth Galbraith, he said, in America, you have the strongest corporations, and that's why you have the strongest unions. That's what he said. It's naturally arises. Well, it doesn't naturally arise. Obviously, American unions have gone down. But, you know, the countervailing power is another form of discipline. And we're both interested. The question is, what form? I think, do you want to say more? We go to questions.
No. Before we go to questions, though, let me just briefly say a good question has one part and not two. It's not more of a comment than a question. And it is almost never about AI. So with that in mind, does anyone have questions?
I love Cory's question rules.
Thank you. So yes, over here. Yeah. No, we'll just repeat it back. We don't give strangers microphones.
So thank you so much for your talk, and I will keep my question short. So I study things from, like, a sociological perspective. So what I approach this question would be, why do you think people sometimes can be so cruel to others?
Why are people so cruel to others? That's a very good question.
Do you want to go first, Cory, or?
No, I can do it. I mean, I think that this is back to discipline. I think people, most people, when they find themselves doing something quite horrible, it's rare that they took a leap from something that from living a life in which they were quite considerate of others to living a life in which they're quite callous. I think it's a stepwise function. I think as humans, we're extremely sensitive to relative difference and not absolute difference. We notice a very small change feels like not a big deal, but we don't look back and see how many small changes we've made consecutively. And this is back to external discipline, because this is how you go full goblin mode. One day it's like, oh, why do I make my bed every morning? I'm just going to get back into it. And before you know it, it's like, well, why do I wear underwear, right? And you need someone around who says, look, I get your efficiency here, right? But there's a point at which you've crossed a line. And I don't think it's an accident that Elon Musk calls people he doesn't like NPCs, non-player characters. I think you become a solipsist when you're surrounded by a bubble, right? I think you cease to believe that other people are genuinely real, and that the moral consideration that other people are worthy of is something that has to be repeatedly impressed on you if you're isolated from them.
I think it's a very good answer, so it's hard to improve on. But I also, maybe I'm just sort of naive or something, but I tend to fall back and think it's about structure. Or in other words, I think there are a class of people who are truly evil and, just do bad things. But I don't think most people are that way. And what I think is that you create environments where what we call evil behavior gets rewarded. Yeah. And that is what leads us astray. I mean, most of the people I know who worked in tech, as we keep saying, were our friends, had very good intentions. There were a couple, and the question is, what kind of things are rewarded? And what does it turn you into? And I guess I've been around enough professions or places to realize it can go in different directions. You have certain environments where being a better person is actually rewarded, and so ideally, and parenting can be like that if it works out well. But then there are other environments where litigation comes to mind. I'm not going to use bad words in front of my own daughter. We're being a belligerent, difficult jerk can actually be like a profit model, and and at some level, we kind of set the rules for these things, or we should, if we want to sort of encourage our better angels. So, yeah.
Other questions? Yes, all the way in the back, gentleman in the gray jumper. Yeah.
So, talked a lot about Google. Sorry, Cory, this is an AI question, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that AI becomes our dominant form of search. Is it conceivable? I mean, you talked a lot about regulation, breaking up companies and so on. No problem with that. But isn't it all conceivable, for example, that in the future, DeepSeek takes 30% of the search market, OpenAI takes another 30%, and Google remains with another 30%? Is that at all?
So can AI be? Yeah. Well, can AI be the new market entrant that erodes the dominance of Google and displaces them?
Yeah, that is something that the people who run competition or antitrust authority should be supporting or trying to make happen, if that makes sense. I mean, I'm a believer, a big believer in succession in almost all systems, political or corporate or whatever. In other words, I don't know how long it has got to be, but new blood, new leadership. And one of the reasons I think the U.S. has been successful in tech is that it every 30 years or so has some kind of debt-clearing invention that kind of brings a new set of people to the table with ideas and sort of utopian hopes of the kind we're talking about. I'm not quite sure OpenAI is in that category. So I think that outcome is possible, and it should be encouraged. I think that's obvious to me. One of the reasons, frankly, for bringing this lawsuit against Google was to try to encourage this and try to make sure Google just didn't buy up or control or occupy. I think the worst thing that could happen, I mean, you sort of assume that OpenAI will want to do this. The worst thing that could happen in our time with artificial intelligence. And actually, why I think they're investing so hard is to defend the current system. I think, you might disagree, Cory, but I think that the real returns, if you think hard, like there's a lot of people are like, what is all this investment about? Where is the money going to come from? Defending an existing situation that is very profitable is very valuable. So I wonder how much of the current investment is actually defense. So I think that's what you want to have happen, but I do worry about a future where AI becomes a fortification of existing market power.
So we do disagree, I think, on this. So first of all, I think the reason Google is spending on AI is the same reason they tried to do Google Plus. It's the same reason Facebook did the pivot to video. It's the same reason for metaverse and cryptocurrency. It's that you know, every company that's a growth company wants to remain a growth company. They have a much higher price to earnings ratio. Their stock is highly liquid. They can make acquisitions out of stock instead of with cash. If you imagine two firms bidding against each other, one of which can bid with stock and the other one can bid with cash, the stock company always wins, right? They just make more stock on the premises by typing zeros into a spreadsheet. How can you possibly outbid them? And so growth begets growth, right? But eventually you run out of growth headroom. You have a 90% search market share. The only way to grow is to breed 100 billion or a billion humans to maturity and hope that they become Google users, which is Google Classroom, but it takes a decade, right? And in the meantime, right, you're always in danger of the market deciding that you're a mature company and staging a sell-off and your P/E ratio falling. So we've had this string of hustles to try and make the companies stay bigger. And so I don't think that they necessarily disbelieve in them. I think there were people at Google who thought that they could displace Facebook and take its market. I think there were people at Facebook who thought they could displace Yahoo and take its market. I don't know if anyone ever believed in cryptocurrency, but these other things people believed in. And the thing is that I just don't think AI is plausible. First of all, because I think that the thing that they say AI can do, which is eventually become intelligent enough to operate with minimal supervision or no supervision, requires a kind of phase change that no one has a theoretical explanation for. They're saying, well, maybe, you know, if we make the word guessing program, give it enough words, it will wake up. And if we're lucky, it will become God and not turn us into paper clips. And I think this is like, well, if we keep breeding these horses to run faster and faster, eventually one of them will give birth to a locomotive, right? Like humans are not word guessing programs who know more words. But also, like, even if you believe that, the market case just falls apart. $600 to $700 billion in capex to date, $1 trillion in capex commitments on a going forward basis in the midterm, near term, $60 billion total revenue annually for the entire sector, if you believe their numbers, which you absolutely should not, because that includes the $10 billion that Microsoft gives to OpenAI and OpenAI gives back to Microsoft. That is not revenue, right? The assets are being depreciated on a 5-year depreciation schedule. They, in fact, sweat those assets so hard that the GPUs burn out in 2 or 3 years at the most. And the 7 companies that are a third of the stock market are passing around the same $100 billion IOU over and over again, and each of them claiming it as revenue. And so I don't even know that there is any economic case for keeping a foundation model online except as a research project. And I would not be surprised if when the dust settles on the crash that is coming, that will make 2008 look like a walk in the park, and whose biggest risk will not be what happens with AI, but the potential for authoritarian fascist uprisings in the wake of enormous economic calamities. I wouldn't be surprised if the number of foundation models online will be 0. So I think that this question about, like, what will Google do if AI works, it's a bit like, what will we do if the Saudi Arabia ever finishes building NEOM, right? Like, it's true, right? Like, NEOM will disrupt the migration patterns of many birds. I've seen all these charts about it. It's like, well, yes, if they ever built NEOM, it would be very bad for birds. But all they've got is like a hole in the sand, right? Like, and that's all they were ever gonna have, right? They have one 2-lane road that goes from there to the port where all the materials come from. They're not building a thing that will consume 100% of the world's cement production year on year for the next 20 years, right? It's just not gonna happen. So, like, worrying about migrating birds is good, but worrying about migrating birds in the case of NEOM is beside the point.
I'll just say that wanting to be seen as a growth company in defense can be consistent. I'll just say that. And yeah, well, what else? Well, who's next?
Sure, right there in the black jumper. Yep.
So there were a couple of stories that you told that involved people working in tech and then going on to do something else. And it seems like there's a bit of a revolving door in Silicon Valley where it's people work for tech companies, get out, and then want to fix the problems that they may have helped create. Thinking things like altruism, open planet.
Yeah.
Good example. Do you think that those sorts of trends are something that can be helpful for fixing the sort of problems you're talking about, or something that we should avoid?
So what should we think about the revolving door as people leave firms and then they declare themselves to be foursquare against those firms?
Well, it depends where they go, doesn't it, too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's your answer? You've worked in public sector.
That's a good question. I think it's hard to have a universal answer, I guess, which is a little maybe boring, in the sense that there are some people who leave. Tristan Harris is a good example. He left school and he's very motivated to try to. Was he a Google? Yeah. He's upset about the attention capturing mechanisms and wants to devote his life to fighting them. I was in Silicon Valley, a Silicon Valley company that had a business model very much like the one you described, where we took the same amount of money and passed it around and paid people to buy our products. So that kind of motivated me. And the products we were building were so bad and so frankly evil that it made me come up with net neutrality as like a cure for what I had created. So I actually am someone who kind of left and went to academia to fight what I'd seen. So I guess that I'm including that category. Some people are there. Some people see, particularly government as a chance to do their former master's bidding and come to government with a very deep loyalty to whoever they were before, with a kind of subtle understanding that they're almost on loan to do some stuff and then come back later. And there's supposed to be rules that kind of prevent that
Don't
from
the banks
happening.
do that? They give you time off and a bonus if you go work for the government?
Yeah, I think Kate knows more about that. But there's some people who go. Kate Judge, my wife in the front, who understands banking, and I've sort of sworn to never talk about banking in public because I always make an idiot of myself. So, but basically, there's people who definitely have that in mind as their own personal profit model, just to spend a year or two in government. So it's hard to generalize, but there are occasional people who come in with this passion and they understand the belly of the beast.
And I'll say that a cartel of 5 giant firms is often so opaque that only insiders can understand it. But the answer to that is to spread out pluralize the power of that firm, not to just hire insiders from the firms to, oversee them. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah. No, you. Yeah.
Yes. So both of you have talked in various ways about the history of tech regulation and made various comments that were sort of something like, oh, they were warned this would happen, but they did it anyway. So I'm wondering to what extent you say, well, the reason they did it anyway is because that's what they wanted to happen, and to what extent they were just, not believing it or. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think I think Cory's the one who said that, but I kind of want to interpret carefully what he was saying. I think Cory was saying people in government were warned, that if you allow these companies to monopolize these sectors, eventually, even though they seem really cute and awesome right now, that they're going to start to enshittify. Well, they didn't quite put it that way. And so the idea is that I think what Cory is saying, if I'm interpreting you correctly.
We should just repeat the question. I'm sorry, I forgot to do that part.
Go ahead.
The question is, they were warned and they did it anyway. Is this what they wanted? I beg your pardon.
And you mean the government. But I think that, having been in government, I think people drank the Kool-Aid and really believed, no, there's something special. I mean, new technologies have this kind of extraordinary effect on people's minds, especially in Washington, D.C., where no one wants to be the guy who kills the golden goose or be the Luddite or no one wants to be labeled that way. And I think in my experience in government, there was a lot of that, like, oh no, they're going to self-regulate, they're going to take care of this problem themselves. Even though people warned them, as Cory said, but people, just no willingness to go there, and maybe they wanted a job at that company later too.
I think that this can't be just this question of did they want it or didn't they can't be disentangled from the 40-year project of neoliberal economics. And the point of neoliberal economics is really to dismantle the post-war consensus that no one is so important that they should control a whole sector of the economy, that each one of us is subject to the foibles and the short-sightedness and the problems that disqualify us from it. And then what we need is a kind of pluralized set of powers with strong labor, government, many firms competing against each other, that all of these things are what produce the dynamism and the value of it. And really the idea of neoliberalism is that, as Boris Johnson said, if you shake the cornflakes box hard enough, all the little cornflakes go to the bottom and all the big ones go to the top, right? That was the point. It was to produce billionaires. And so there have been a succession of people in government and in policy and in the judiciary who've taken that as their principle. And they were often educated at enormous expense to believe this. So in the US, there's a series of continuing education seminars for judges called the Mann Seminars, M-A-N-N-E. 40% of the federal judiciary is a graduate of the Mann Seminars, and judges have to go for continuing education, just like doctors and other professionals. And there were free junkets at a luxury resort in Florida where you'd just be lectured about how monopolies were good. And there's some empirical work on this that measures their judgments before and after being educated at the Mann Seminar. And unsurprisingly, because it was bankrolled over and over again by the billionaires who wanted to change antitrust law, judges do change how they rule after they've been to these seminars and been bamboozled with a bunch of, mathy seeming models that seem to reduce these important qualitative questions to a kind of dubious quantitative residue that can be operated on in a model, and that show that, up is down, black is white, and monopolies are efficient. And
what a nice sentence that was, by the way.
Say again?
That was a great sentence.
Oh, well, thank you.
I admire that sentence.
And so, yeah, so that, I think that it was bought and paid for. I don't want to sound like a conspiratorialist, but it's not really a conspiracy because the Mann Seminars existed, the empirical research is out there. It happened. Yeah. We have a question from the tubes.
Yeah, so we can't get to all the questions online. Some of them are about what can we do? Thank you, Cory. Some of the questions online are like, what can we do? A little bit of it, I'd say, is in the book. I have one here I'd really like to hear your answers on. It says, Europe's taken a restrictive approach to competition and data protection. Its contribution to the development of the internet and big tech has not really been so significant. Can the U.S. political choices be defended on the basis that they've created conditions for the products we enjoy every day?
Do you want to take a hack at that?
I think the answer is no. I think that those products that we enjoy every day were created, were pretty much mature 10 years ago. And the last 10 years, so I have a kind of dynamic view of this. Which is to say, yes, I do think an infant industry, a bunch of little guys, needs some room early on. And I think the United States was good about saying, there's these new guys, just like the personal computer in the 80s or 70s, give them some room. We're not going to, and resisted some of the efforts to try to kill the internet industry at the beginning through things like copyright or other measures. But then by 2015, people figured out the stuff that was on the web, some of the most significant, and they'd become fairly mature. And the last 10 years of innovation have mainly been extraction innovation, have mainly been figuring out ways not to make you leave, to like very clever ways of taking more money for the same kind of thing. I mean, it kind of reminds me of the airline industry, especially in the United States, who basically have not changed their product in 40 years, but just found different ways to charge you more for the same thing. And I think government plays an important role, first in letting innovation happen, but then trying to, head innovation into different directions. And the fact is, extraction innovation, price innovation. It's a good example of price innovation? All these fees added to everything you buy. Because obviously, if you think something is, let's say, $57 with a $27 fee, you're actually more likely to buy it than if you had the full price. And those are good, and there's a million different ways of, and there's been like so much effort. Advertising is full of techniques to try to make you click on things that you don't want to click on. There's just been a whole generation of basically wasted innovation, and like we could have headed that off. I mean, one of the points of government intervention is to cut off the stupid business models or the ones that just hurt everybody and try and channel things in more productive directions.
Yeah, so I was yesterday in London on a podcast with our mutual friend Christina Cafara, who's the sort of doyen of antitrust in Europe, and she was being very down on European tech entrepreneurs, and she said no one wants to do anything. We don't do anything here. We just complain and we make rules and so on. And I was defending the European tech sector because I don't think there's something about the European character that changed between an era in which Europe made products that were used all over the world and now, and I think the fact that Europe is so bullshit about regulating big tech has to do with the fact that the companies are called Google and Facebook and Apple and not Olivetti, Deutsche Telekom, and Amstrad. And, you can ask yourself, would Olivetti have ever shipped a successful typewriter if it were illegal to reproduce the QWERTY keyboard? Would Nokia have ever shipped a phone if it were illegal to connect it to the phone network, right? So if we want to ask ourselves why there hasn't been tech innovation in Europe, it's because most innovation starts with complementary goods. Right? You make a thing that plugs into a thing or improves a thing or patches a hole in a thing or goes on top of a thing or, composts and buries a thing that is better. And so you have this ready-made customer base and they come over to you, right? You don't have to be entirely de novo. You don't have to invent a new thing every time. You have this kind of blended set of innovations, these incremental and sometimes revolutionary ones that overcome these old things. And Europe just tied its hands. Now, as to European privacy law, I think it's ridiculous to say that Europe has enforced privacy law because they haven't. What they've done is discovered the great fatal flaw of federalism, which is that the state with the weakest regulatory regime is the one that all the worst offenders go to. And of course, I'm talking about Ireland, right? Because if you're going to be a tax haven, you also have to be a crime haven, because any company that can pretend it's Irish this week can pretend it's Maltese next week. And so the only way you keep them from upping sticks and moving across the channel is by not enforcing other laws, which is how you get the Irish data commissioner, who most days doesn't bother getting out of bed. And if they happen to do so, they sit around in their underwear watching cartoons and eating breakfast cereal all day. And so all of the smaller, actually European companies that were violating Europeans' privacy were extinguished within about 10 seconds of the passage of the GDPR, leaving an open field for giant American firms to violate privacy with an aggression barely seen in history, right? And so it's again, we shouldn't be saying, oh, there's something mystically European that caused this, and there's something mystically American that caused this. Not when we can locate policy decisions that actually had the foreseeable and foreseen outcome of causing this.
Yeah, I have a lot more, but I think we should gather some. I think we're about out of time.
Yeah,
aren't
let's.
we?
What do
we should gather? I have a lot more to say about
party
Europe.
trick, which is we're going to gather say 6 questions and answer them in 8 minutes. So stick your hands up. Okay, we're going to go 1, 2, 3. You in the hat. 4. The woman in the jumper. And then I'll do 3 more. So let's start. Who is 1? Yeah, you got right.
Yeah, it's very open-ended. It's a question about the news industry, the impact on
News.
Big tech.
What do we do about big tech in the news? All right. Who is 2? Yeah.
Yeah, so previously you've described the people who've made the internet worse as venal or slimy.
Right.
Not corrupt and criminal.
Why are big tech barons venal and slimy and not corrupt and criminal? Or why are politicians venal and slimy and not corrupt and criminal? Are Paul's criminals, right? Okay, next, who is 3rd? Yeah, go ahead.
Taking advantages of countries losing leverage on others, like the US losing a lot of leverage. Is there anything that smaller countries or countries in general can do to not be taken advantage in that way by larger economies?
How can smaller countries resist larger countries' hegemony? I think it was you in the back, yeah?
What are your opinions on the reemergence of decentralized networks such as the Fediverse or alternatives such as Blue Sky?
Blue Sky and Fediverse. Okay, and 2 more. Put your hands up. Okay, I'll go 1. And yeah, why not? Right. Okay, go.
Why are you still proposing so many policy solutions instead of some guerrilla interoperability attack on big tech? When you gave us such amazing anecdotes about how raison d'etat prompts, it's the first thing that matters. They want big tech companies that dominate the world and that they can spy through.
Right. So why policy solutions instead of seizing the means of computation? Right. And then yeah.
We've both got some really interesting structural solutions to the state of the internet. But my question goes back to your friend from Newfoundland who said, how do we get from here to there?
Yeah. How do we get from here to there? Okay, so the first one is big tech and news. So this is an area where we have a disagreement.
Yeah.
Go.
We're going to be all, I mean, I think I said earlier, I think, and if you look at chapter 10 or so, I think they should be allowed to collectively bargain.
So
That
I
makes
think
sense.
collective bargaining sounds fine to me, but the way it's played out in the world is what we've called link taxes, where we create a para-copyright and having a place to talk about the news or link to the news. I don't think it's bad for the news to talk about the news or link to the news. I think news you're not allowed to find or talk about isn't news, it's a secret. And I think that the thing that's stolen from the news by tech companies isn't news, it's money. They take a 30% app tax out of every subscriber pound. They take a 51% app tax or ad tax out of every advertising dollar, and they steal money on social media by charging you to access the people who ask to see your feed. And I think that the last thing we want is for media companies to be dependent on the tech companies. We want them to watchdog. In Canada, when we rolled out the app tax, the first immediate effect was after.
Sorry, this we're not going to get through eight.
Okay.
Eight
After
questions.
Google
You got to hold on to the minute.
Their investigative reports on tech companies. Okay, are
I'm disciplining you at this point.
Are politicians criminals, or are they just slimy and venal?
I think it was. I agree with you said about being misguided, and sometimes I think people want to get a job. I mean, there is this idea when I worked in government where industries take very careful note of whose side you're on, and then try to sort of blackball you, and make it clear that if you're against them, you're never going to get like a meaningful job ever, and you're going to have to work in academia or other less remunerative places, or you can work, see things their way and maybe have $1 million a year job where you don't have to do anything. So does that make people venal? I guess that's venal.
What can smaller countries do? I have a brief answer here. Nokia was the sick man of Europe. Or Finland was the sick man of Europe. They took their most famous rubber boot manufacturer, Nokia, retooled them to make mobile phones. They ruled the world for a decade. They speak a language no one else in the world can understand. It was still incredibly successful. There's nothing about being a small country with a linguistic minority and a resource extraction economy that prohibits this, but what they were able to do is plug into a network that existed around the world.
And Switzerland is another excellent example of that small country being successful in, not in the internet. I think that this is a much longer conversation, but there was this strange moment where almost the whole world said, okay, we'll accept your platforms as a monopoly in our country. Yeah. And that's like, this is counter to U.S. interest. It's been very good for the United States, but it's, to me, kind of crazy countries let that happen.
Yeah. Blue Sky and the Fediverse.
You go ahead on that.
Sure. So, I mean, I like this idea that we have these decentralized platforms. To me, the most important thing is that it's very easy to migrate from one Fediverse server to another. You can just click a link and then click a link and you're somewhere else, like moving from, E to Vodafone. And I think that imposes very powerful discipline. You make things bad for your customers and they're out like a shot. I think that that's what we should want. We should commodify the network you use. What should matter is who you're talking to. No one has ever rung a friend up to say, you would not believe whose SIM is in my phone today, right? It just shouldn't matter which technology you're using. It should matter who you're talking to. And then why policy solutions and not guerrilla solutions?
Well, why one or the other? I guess the question is, I mean, my brother was much better programmed than me, so I let that to him. It's not, I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I'll just put it that way. I mean, what do you think, Cory?
Well, I'm going to merge this with Ray's question about how we get there. So I think that we've seen with the European Commission and the European Union trying to discipline Apple and say, oh, you have to open up the App Store. It's very hard to get a company that big to do as they're told, right? Apple's first answer was, okay, we'll allow other app stores, but we'll charge junk fees that exceed the fees you pay in the Apple Store. And if we think your phone's been out of the EU for 20 consecutive days, we'll delete all your apps and your data. Their second answer was, no, we'll just stop selling phones in Europe. And then their third answer was, we'll file 18 lawsuits that'll tie this up for 10 years. It's very hard to get these companies to do what we want them to do. But there is one entity that the European Commission has absolute and perfect control over, which is the European Commission. And so if the European Commission were to withdraw its offer to Apple to use European legal resources to vaporize any company that reverse engineers the iPhone, right, which is a policy intervention you have to make. You have to start there so you can do capital formation so that you can, rather than like having a guy down at a car boot sale jailbreak your phone for you, there's like at the big Tesco, there's like a thing in the cashier's aisle that's just a dongle you plug into your phone that installs a third-party app store that's backed by a guarantee and which tells you it's a good bargain, right? That if we do that, it's a thing that absolutely the European Commission can do on its own recognizance without making Apple do a single thing it doesn't want to do. So that's what I think.
My answer to that, what do you do? And I know we're out of time, but I'll talk about a similar point of history in the United States. In the 19th century in the U.S., farmers were subject to the platform of that time, or the essential technology, which were the railroads. and railroads had kind of an absolute almost power over farmers and other kind of merchants. There was almost a revolution in late 19th century in the United States. There was this movement called the Granger movement. And eventually, they were so afraid of this turning into a revolution or anarchism or some kind of craziness happening, Congress decided to heavily regulate the railroads. So, I think many of us sort of given up on government, think it's hopeless, but with the right kind of existential pressure, I think you can get results.
Okay, so we're gonna race upstairs. I brought this. It's a device I bought on the internet that makes books non-returnable. I'll demonstrate it for you.
I want to thank our audience. I
Thank
also
you
want to
very
thank my mother who tolerated having a bulletin board system in our basement. Thank you very much. My wife came
Thank
as
you
well.
all for coming.
Yeah.
Thanks for hosting
And
us.
thanks for such short questions. Bye-bye.